When civilization actually buckles, not the weekend power outage, not the two-day ice storm, when the machinery genuinely grinds to a halt, the majority of people won't make it. And the reason won't be a bad call under pressure. It won't be cowardice. It won't be a missing piece of kit or a YouTube tutorial they forgot to bookmark. They'll go down because of their address. Period. That's the brutal, boring, unsatisfying truth sitting underneath all the tactical chatter and gear reviews and bug-out bag reveals. Your coordinates on the map, the water table beneath your shoes, the temperature swings across your calendar year, how many desperate strangers are within walking distance of your front door. Those variables will seal your fate long before your training or your mindset gets a vote. And the survival content machine absolutely does not want to broadcast that message, because it deflates the whole premise. If your zip code matters more than your preparation, then what's the point of buying all that stuff? What's the point of the courses, the mentorship programs, the $400 fixed blade knife? Look, preparation matters. I'm not dismissing it. But preparation has a ceiling, and that ceiling is lower than anyone selling you freeze-dried buckets wants to admit. Your stockpile depletes, your preserved food degrades, your ammo gets spent or becomes trade currency. Somebody stumbles across your cache while you're out checking snares. Everything you've hoarded has an expiration date, including the security of having it at all. When the preps run dry, you're naked in front of whatever landscape surrounds you. And that landscape either sustains human life without industrial support, or it doesn't. No amount of tactical training changes the rainfall patterns. No amount of mental toughness puts fish in a dry riverbed. So let's do a thought experiment that makes this concrete. Picture two people, carbon copies of each other, identical fitness, identical gear, identical knowledge base, identical determination. Now drop one into the middle of Tucson, Arizona. Drop the other onto a rural property in central Wisconsin. The Tucson person is spending every waking hour hunting for water. The entire water delivery system across the American Southwest was engineered around one assumption: that electricity would perpetually push water through hundreds of miles of pipeline across bone-dry terrain. The second that assumption breaks, the system doesn't degrade gracefully. It just stops. No grid, no pumps. No pumps, no water. No water, you're a corpse inside 5 to 7 days. The Wisconsin person is dipping a bucket into a spring-fed pond, collecting rain off the barn roof, pulling walleye out of a creek that hasn't gone dry in recorded history, and eyeing the neighbor's cornfield to figure out planting timelines for spring. Identical human beings. Wildly different survival math. That's the lens for everything that follows. Not some fantasy ranking of paradise bunker locations. Every single spot on this planet will test you. Every one has failure modes that'll gut you if you get sloppy. What we're actually evaluating here is which American states possess the raw natural infrastructure to keep humans breathing when the synthetic systems holding modern life together go offline. We're measuring water that doesn't need to be imported, soil that actually grows food, population numbers that don't immediately trigger a resource war, energy sources that exist without a functioning national grid, climates that are survivable without climate control technology, and the cultural memory. People who still carry functional knowledge about doing hard things with their hands, because those skills never went extinct in their communities. That last factor gets criminally ignored. Let's fix that. Real states, real advantages, real problems, no fairy tales. Here we go. 1. Idaho. The one nobody's hyping. Idaho flies completely under the radar. People daydream about fleeing to Montana or building compounds in Colorado, but Idaho barely enters the conversation. And that anonymity? That's one of the primary reasons it earns the top slot. Fewer than 2 million human beings scattered across a landmass, packed with deep forest, serious mountain terrain, and wide agricultural valleys. When the trucks stop rolling, and in a genuine systemic failure, freight networks crater fast and ugly, the number of people fighting over the same resources becomes the single most important variable. It dictates how fast things turn violent. It dictates how long local food actually stretches. It dictates whether the people around you become allies or adversaries. Idaho simply doesn't have a crowding problem. There's physical breathing room between communities. That buffer is worth more than most people can calculate until they've watched what happens in dense environments under resource stress. The water situation here is legitimately strong. Snowpack melting off mountain ranges keeps rivers flowing reliably through the year. Underground aquifers are deep and dependable. You're not praying for seasonal rain patterns to cooperate the way you would further south. Stack that against the southwestern states currently surviving on engineering miracles, water piped across staggering distances through networks that collapse the instant power fails, and Idaho's advantage becomes almost absurd. The water here is underneath you and falling on you. It doesn't need a power plant to reach your glass. Food production in Idaho isn't theoretical or boutique. Potatoes, cereal grains, cattle operations. This state has been generating serious agricultural output for generations. These aren't Instagram homesteads with 4 raised beds and a goat. These are legitimate production systems with real capacity. When national logistics go dark, Idaho's food output contracts, but it persists. That gap between shrinks and disappears is the difference between hardship and extinction. Now the reality check. Idaho winters will absolutely end your life if you treat them casually. Not a rough experience. Not a character-building weekend. A lethal situation. If your heating plan requires a functioning electrical grid, you've written your own death certificate. The saving grace is that rural Idaho hasn't abandoned the old ways. Wood-burning stoves are standard equipment, not decorative antiques. Hunting and fishing aren't recreation. They're how people actually fill their kitchens. These competencies transfer between generations because they're still in active daily use. When sophisticated systems crumble, the people still operating on simple, proven methods don't even notice the collapse. They just keep doing what they've always done. 2. Montana, enormous, empty, and unforgiving Montana, takes Idaho's core proposition and turns up every dial. The population drops below 1 million people, occupying a territory roughly comparable in size to Germany. Let that ratio settle in your mind for a moment. In collapse math, Montana's resource competition is essentially a rounding error. There just aren't enough humans relative to the available land, water, timber, wildlife, and soil to spark the kind of frantic scrambling that shreds communities apart. Waterways teeming with trout. Forests dense with elk and deer. Plains holding viable agricultural soil. The raw materials for human survival are present in abundance. But Montana's vastness cuts both ways. The gaps between towns are enormous. Winter storms don't merely inconvenience travelers. They seal communities off completely for weeks at a stretch. Mountain passes become walls. Under those conditions, every settlement transforms into an island. Whether that isolation saves you or buries you depends entirely on what that community stockpiled and knew before the roads became impassable. The agricultural window is punishingly tight. You might squeeze out 3, maybe 4 months without killing frost if conditions cooperate. There is zero margin for error in that calendar. A late planting, a miscalculated harvest timing, sloppy food storage, any of these puts you into a hunger situation well before the next growing season arrives. Montana's land is generous, but only to people who approach it with dead seriousness and real competence. What Montana possesses that simply cannot be replicated or purchased is a living, breathing ranching culture. There are families in Montana right now managing livestock through annual cycles that their great-grandparents would instantly recognize. The knowledge of wintering animals, processing meat without refrigeration, enduring temperatures that would hospitalize most Americans, none of this lives in a manual. It lives in calloused hands and muscle memory passed down across lifetimes. The cold here is savage. 30 below zero isn't an anomaly. It's a scheduled event on the Montana calendar. Without reliable heat sources that operate independently of any grid, survival through a Montana winter is not a challenge, it's an impossibility. This state hands out extraordinary rewards to people who've earned them through preparation, and delivers consequences without a shred of mercy to everyone else. Quick favor, if this is landing for you, smash that like button, drop your state in the comments, and subscribe. It takes 2 seconds, and it actually matters. 3. Wyoming. Fuel under your feet. Nobody over your shoulder Wyoming brings something to the table that almost nothing else on this list can touch at comparable scale. The state is physically sitting on top of massive energy reserves, coal deposits, natural gas fields, oil reserves, in a scenario where national refining is shut down and fuel distribution has flatlined. That proximity to raw energy resources creates advantages that aren't immediately intuitive. Those resources can be converted. They can run local generators. They can produce heat without requiring anything whatsoever from a national infrastructure that no longer exists, while populations elsewhere are stripping forests bare for firewood. Wyoming has combustible deposits beneath the surface waiting to be tapped. The headcount is the smallest of any state in America, under 600,000 people. Even in Wyoming's population centers, the numbers never reach the threshold where resource scarcity triggers desperate behavior in the early phases of collapse. The arithmetic simply works. What exists is sufficient for the people who are present. The complications are logistical and agricultural. Communities sit at serious distances from one another. A February blizzard doesn't just slow things down, it eliminates connectivity between towns for extended periods. You solve your problems with whatever's locally available, or those problems go unsolved. Nobody's crossing those mountain ranges to bail you out. Farming here is constrained by altitude and harsh climate. Cattle ranching works, and people do it extensively, but crop cultivation only functions in specific zones. Hunting and fishing fill critical dietary gaps, but only for people who possess those skills before the crisis arrived. You don't learn to hunt during an emergency. You learn to starve during an emergency. The hunting happens years before. Wyoming is built for people who genuinely desire self-governance and accept the accompanying austerity without complaint. It's not luxurious. It's not convenient. But it's autonomous in a way almost nowhere else can match when external systems stop functioning. 4. Oregon. A state at war with itself, Oregon might be the most internally contradictory state on this entire list. And understanding that contradiction is the difference between a brilliant relocation decision and a fatal one. West of the Cascade Range, you're looking at a temperate, rain-soaked, forested, absurdly fertile landscape. The Willamette Valley ranks among the most productive agricultural zones on the continent. Crops thrive without artificial irrigation because the sky handles watering duties. Old growth and second growth forests offer essentially inexhaustible timber for heating and building. Rivers flow 12 months a year. The Pacific Ocean sits just beyond the tree line, stocked with protein that requires nothing fancier than a vessel and some line to harvest. East of the Cascades, the picture flips entirely. High desert, dry air, bitter winters giving way to scorching summers, sparse population, small communities that have been operating in near total self-sufficiency for so long that most national disruptions barely register in their daily lives. These towns have been functionally disconnected from the systems that would actually fail. Their routines haven't changed significantly in decades, while the rest of America sprinted headlong into total supply chain addiction. Oregon's ecological diversity across its full territory is genuinely staggering. Coastline, dense forest, volcanic mountain ranges, agricultural valleys, arid desert, all contained within a single set of state borders. That variety creates built-in redundancy. Drought hammers the valley, forest resources compensate. Coastal fishing gets disrupted, agricultural output absorbs the gap. Nature spent millennia constructing backup systems here. The honest vulnerability is human, not geographic. The cultural and political chasm between urban Western Oregon and rural Eastern Oregon is deep and real. Under prolonged stress, that fracture doesn't mend, it widens. That's a people problem rather than a terrain problem. But people problems are just as lethal as terrain problems when they escalate. Purely on natural merits, though, Oregon is stacked. Very few states can compete with what it delivers across multiple climate zones simultaneously. 5. Washington. Dams that keep running. When everything else stops, Washington mirrors Oregon's east-west split, but layers on one genuinely singular advantage that warrants close attention: hydroelectric capacity. The state generates enormous quantities of hydroelectric power through its river dam systems. In a scenario where the national electrical grid goes dark, local dams don't automatically cease operations. They can continue producing power at reduced output and distribute electricity to surrounding communities. In a world gone black, that capability isn't a minor perk, it's a civilization-preserving advantage. Refrigeration, water purification, communication, medical equipment. The downstream benefits of maintained electrical generation are enormous. Eastern Washington's agricultural production is substantial. Fruit orchards, wheat fields, dairy operations, hop farms. Under normal conditions, this region feeds its own population and ships massive surpluses elsewhere. When transportation networks collapse, Eastern Washington keeps feeding Eastern Washington. The supply chain doesn't vanish. Its radius just contracts to a range that still functions. Roughly half the state is forested. Timber for construction and fuel is abundant. Both the Pacific coastline and inland river systems support fishing. Wildlife populations across the eastern interior are healthy and accessible. The natural protein pipeline is real and tappable. Western Washington's climate is notably milder than most other entries on this list. Serious snowfall stays in the high elevations where it belongs. Winters are wet and cool, but the heating demand is dramatically lighter than what Montana or the Dakotas impose. That distinction matters enormously because heating failure is one of the top killers in cold weather collapse scenarios. The non-negotiable rule with Washington is identical to Oregon's. Distance yourself from the metro corridors. The Seattle-Tacoma urban band is a population density bomb with a very short fuse. The rural interior is an entirely separate reality. Washington's geography handsomely rewards people who position themselves intelligently within it and punishes everyone who doesn't. Real quick, if you're still with me, that like button and a subscribe genuinely help get this in front of more people. Drop a comment with your thoughts. Back to it. 6. North Dakota. Nobody's dream until the dream matters. Here's a state that wouldn't crack most people's top 20 survival destinations. The winters are vicious. The terrain is relentlessly flat. The summers evaporate fast. There's nothing remotely glamorous about North Dakota. And that total absence of glamour is precisely why it belongs here. Under 800,000 residents. Not merely low density, almost comically low density measured against the state's food-producing capacity. North Dakota generates agricultural output in enormous surplus during normal operations. It feeds millions of mouths located in other states entirely. When systems collapse, that equation inverts overnight. All that production stays local, and local has fewer than 1 million people to sustain. The math isn't close. It's not even competitive. Energy resources echo Wyoming's profile in critical ways. Oil and natural gas at industrial volumes. Local refining infrastructure that can operate under manual protocols during emergencies. The capacity to fuel generators, sustain heating, and keep farm equipment running without importing a single unit of energy from beyond state lines. That's a depth of self-sufficiency that most states can't approach. The social dynamics in North Dakota differ fundamentally from mainstream American life. Compact, tight-knit communities where people have genuine relationships with their neighbors, where cooperation is the default setting, not some aspirational concept. Where collective decisions happen rapidly because everyone has been working alongside the same faces for their entire adult lives. In a real crisis, that social cohesion is a lifesaver. Literally. Resources get shared. Labor gets coordinated. Vulnerabilities get covered, because the alternative is watching each other fail alone. The absolute deal-breaker caveat is the winter. 40 degrees below zero is not a freak occurrence in North Dakota. It's a reliable calendar entry. Without serious heating infrastructure, deep food reserves cached before first snowfall, and legitimate cold weather survival knowledge, you will not see spring. North Dakota doesn't provide a gentle learning curve. It provides a single pass-fail examination. 7. South Dakota. Same strengths, softer edges. South Dakota carries most of North Dakota's structural advantages, while rounding off some of the harshest extremes. The climate is still severe, but it doesn't routinely scrape the basement temperatures that its northern sibling treats as ordinary business. The geography offers more variety. Open plains dominate the east, forested hills fill the west, and massive freshwater reservoir systems thread through the center. The Black Hills region deserves specific attention. Those forests hold significant game populations including deer, elk, and wild turkey, all accessible to people with genuine hunting capability. The ability to source both animal protein and firewood from the same general area is a meaningful logistical advantage. You're not making long, exposed trips to gather different categories of essential resources from scattered locations. The Missouri River system feeds reservoirs containing extraordinary freshwater volumes. Clean water access in South Dakota is simply not a crisis variable. The water exists. It's distributed broadly. It doesn't depend on complex engineered systems to reach populated areas. Agricultural patterns mirror North Dakota's model. Crops cultivated on natural rainfall rather than extensive pumped irrigation. When electrically powered irrigation networks fail across drought-vulnerable states, South Dakota's fields continue producing. That single distinction separates states that remain fed from states that face famine within a few months. South Dakota's near-total invisibility in popular survival discourse might actually be its most valuable hidden attribute. When a location gets marketed as a survival haven, it attracts people. Waves of them. Unprepared people who arrive desperate. who immediately begin competing for every available resource a community spent years building up. South Dakota's low profile isn't a weakness, it's armor. 8. Maine. The eastern seaboard's lone exception, the East Coast, has almost no viable entries for this conversation. Too densely packed, too enmeshed in fragile supply networks, too urbanized to function when systems fail. Maine stands apart, and it stands apart considerably. The state occupies a geographically insulated position. Dense forests and meaningful distances create a natural buffer zone separating it from the massive population centers of the broader Northeast. Under 1.5 million people, with roughly half living in authentically rural conditions. Forest covers approximately 90% of the state's land area. Timber resources for heating, construction, and basic tool fabrication are functionally infinite. You don't run out of trees in Maine. Hunting culture here is genuine and generational. Moose, deer, bear, wildlife populations are robust and available to people with real field skills. Communities exist in Maine right now where hunting is simply part of how families provision themselves. Not a weekend hobby, not a retirement fantasy, an ongoing practical component of household food supply. The coastline is among Maine's most quietly powerful assets. Commercial fishing and lobstering operate at serious scale because the ocean produces at serious scale. Coastal communities have preserved functional fishing knowledge and working equipment across generations. When modern distribution networks collapse, those communities don't lose their food source. They've been pulling it from the water for their entire lives. They simply stop shipping the catch south and consume it locally. Agriculture faces real constraints: cold climate, rocky soil, compressed growing season. But the state produces potatoes, dairy, and sufficient vegetable crops to sustain its relatively modest population. Local output is enough, and in a collapse, enough is the only word that matters. The self-reliance ethic in Maine is not performative. People split their own cordwood because that's how they heat their homes. People tend gardens because that's how they eat. People hunt because that's how they stock the freezer. When collapse arrives, these people don't undergo some dramatic lifestyle pivot. They just keep living the way they already were. Tap that like button, leave a comment telling me what you think, and subscribe if you haven't. More coming. Let's keep going. 9. Vermont. Tiny, connected, and already operating the way everyone else will have to. Vermont holds about 600,000 people. You could absorb the entire state population into one mid-sized American city and still have vacant apartments. In collapse resilience terms, that compactness is among its strongest structural advantages. The state is overwhelmingly rural. Its cities are small. Villages are the norm. Communities are interconnected in ways that have become increasingly uncommon across modern America. People have real substantive relationships with their neighbors. That social connectivity converts directly into collective survival capacity when conditions deteriorate. Rapid decision-making, resource sharing, mutual aid. These behaviors don't require emergency organizing when the organizing has been happening organically across hundreds of small towns for generations. Agriculture in Vermont is small-scale, but meaningfully diverse. Dairy anchors the food economy, but vegetables, livestock, and the maple syrup sector all contribute. This isn't a state that has ever produced surplus for the nation, but it produces enough for Vermont. And when systems crash, enough for Vermont is the exact and complete definition of enough. Water is abundant. Forests blanket 3/4 of the state. Rivers are everywhere. Natural springs are common. Securing clean water would not present a serious challenge in a Vermont collapse scenario. The natural infrastructure handles it. Vermont maintains one of the lowest violent crime rates in the country, and that's not accidental. Rural communities built on trust and mutual reliance don't produce the chronic interpersonal friction that dense urban environments generate. In a collapse, low baseline social tension is a genuine survival multiplier. Communities that aren't already fractured have energy available to direct toward actual problems: food, shelter, fuel, medicine, instead of burning it on internal conflict. What makes Vermont particularly compelling is its pre-existing infrastructure around local food systems. Community-supported agriculture operations, food cooperatives, farmers markets, direct farm-to-consumer networks. These aren't trendy side projects in Vermont. They've been structural pillars of how the state feeds itself for decades. When a collapse forces the rest of the country to figure out local food sourcing in a panic, Vermont already has the systems, the relationships, and the institutional knowledge humming along. The alternative infrastructure simply becomes the primary infrastructure. The transition barely registers. Winter here is serious. Heavy snowfall, real cold, no option to wing it. But the housing stock was built for it. Fireplaces and wood stoves are common installations, not architectural novelties. Stacking cordwood in autumn is a seasonal ritual, not emergency preparation. Vermont endures winter because Vermont has always endured winter. That knowledge isn't academic, it's embedded in how people construct their lives. 10. Texas. The giant that defies simple answers. Texas resists tidy categorization. It's too vast, too internally contradictory, too varied across every relevant dimension to reduce to a clean summary. But excluding it would be dishonest, because Texas possesses structural advantages of genuine magnitude sitting right alongside vulnerabilities of equal magnitude. The critical factor is understanding which version of Texas you actually occupy. 30 million people. That number alone obliterates any blanket statement about Texas resilience. Dallas falls apart. Houston falls apart. San Antonio falls apart. Any major metro concentration collapses when supply chains halt. And Texas contains several enormous ones. Resource competition inside those cities would become immediate, intense, and genuinely dangerous within days of serious disruption. Rural Texas, particularly the eastern and northern reaches, is a fundamentally different proposition. Agricultural output here is massive by any standard. Beef, poultry, corn, wheat, cotton, the volume of food production is staggering. Without national transportation networks, that production doesn't evaporate. It remains local. And local Texas possesses the capacity to feed substantial populations even when the national system goes silent. The electrical grid situation is genuinely unique. Texas operates its own grid, substantially independent from the national interconnected system. If the national grid fails, Texas retains more capability to maintain local power generation than virtually any other state. Pair that with enormous domestic oil and natural gas reserves, refinable within state borders, and the energy self-sufficiency picture becomes exceptionally hard to replicate elsewhere. Water is where the story fractures. Western Texas is legitimately arid. The aquifers sustaining Western Texas are being drawn down right now, faster than natural recharge, before any collapse scenario enters the picture. Without electrical pumping systems accessing deep water, large swaths of Western Texas become uninhabitable within weeks. Summer heat in those zones without air conditioning creates lethal conditions rapidly. Not uncomfortable conditions, fatal conditions. Eastern Texas reshuffles the deck substantially. More precipitation, more river systems, higher humidity. The eastern portion has water accessibility that the western portion simply lacks. If you're positioning yourself in Texas for genuine long-term resilience, eastern or northern rural Texas represents a completely different survival equation than the western desert regions or Gulf Coast metros. Heat is Texas's most chronically underestimated threat. The survival community obsesses over freezing and completely ignores baking. Summer temperatures without mechanical cooling are deadly, not just for the elderly or ill, but for anyone who hasn't acclimatized and lacks a cooling strategy. Heat kills on timelines comparable to extreme cold, and it doesn't discriminate. Texas rewards surgical positioning within its borders, rural east or north, with reliable water access, real advantages. Urban anywhere or western arid zones, serious and potentially terminal problems. 11. Minnesota. The forgotten middle ground. Minnesota deserves mention because it combines several critical survival variables that rarely coexist. Over 10,000 lakes isn't just a license plate slogan. It's a freshwater abundance almost unmatched in the continental United States. Clean water access in a Minnesota collapse scenario is about as close to a non-issue as geography allows. Agricultural capacity is enormous. The state produces grains, dairy, livestock, and sugar beets at industrial scale. The soil is deep and naturally fertile across much of the southern and western regions. When national logistics fail, Minnesota's agricultural output contracts but continues feeding a state population that, while larger than the Dakotas, remains manageable relative to production capacity. The winters are brutal, comparable to North Dakota in the northern reaches, and that's the non-negotiable cost of entry. But Minnesota's strong Scandinavian-rooted cultural heritage has embedded cold weather competence deep into community DNA. People know how to manage harsh winters because their families have been doing it for over a century without interruption. The social fabric in rural Minnesota communities is tight. Cooperative culture runs deep, from agricultural co-ops to volunteer fire departments to community grain elevators. These aren't symbolic institutions, they're operational frameworks for collective resource management that translate directly into crisis coordination. Minnesota's primary vulnerability is proximity to the Twin Cities metro, which houses over half the state's population. In a collapse scenario, that urban mass creates a significant refugee pressure vector on surrounding rural communities. Distance from the metro corridor matters enormously in Minnesota survival calculations. 12. Arkansas, cheap, wet, and overlooked Arkansas almost never appears in survival discussions, which might be one of its strongest qualifications. The state receives abundant rainfall, supports extensive river and stream networks, and sits atop significant groundwater reserves. Water scarcity is simply not part of the Arkansas equation. The Ozark region in the northwest offers forested hilly terrain with natural defensibility, low population density, and established communities with deep roots in subsistence-adjacent living. Hunting, fishing, gardening, and livestock management aren't nostalgic hobbies in rural Arkansas. They're ongoing lifestyle components. The growing season is long compared to northern states, often 6 months or more of frost-free cultivation. That extended window dramatically increases food production potential and allows for multiple planting cycles. The soil in the river valleys is fertile and responsive. Agriculture here doesn't require the desperate intensity of a 3-month Montana growing season. The climate is manageable year-round without industrial heating or cooling. Winters are cold but rarely extreme, and summers, while hot and humid, are survivable without air conditioning for acclimatized individuals. That moderate climate profile is a quiet but enormous advantage. You're not fighting the weather to stay alive in Arkansas the way you are in Wyoming or North Dakota. Cost of land is low, population density is modest, and the cultural baseline leans heavily toward practical self-sufficiency. Arkansas lacks the dramatic appeal of mountain states, but it quietly checks nearly every fundamental survival box.